Canadians are proud of their resource-based economy, especially the oil and gas sector. We're the best at what we do, and we develop our resources using the highest international climate, environmental, safety, and labor standards. Simply put, we have the best people, equipment, and regulatory processes found anywhere in the world. Yet unfortunately, there are radical groups who advocate a misguided and dangerous course for Canada. Their tactics are intimidation and fear. Their goal is for us to give up and to give in to their irrational and unreasonable agenda. They claim regular Canadians support their message, but we know the vast majority of Canadians support oil workers and oil families and the economic and social benefits the industry provides the country. It is no longer acceptable to be on the sidelines while our country and way of life is seemingly negotiated and lobbied away by extremists. You simply cannot negotiate with groups that call for the end of an entire industry and spread misinformation and lies. Unfortunately, the hallways of Parliament are full of environmental elites who are busy lobbying our federal government while hundreds of thousands of Canadians are without work and without hope for an immediate recovery. The Oil Respect campaign has three main goals. First, we want to address the misinformation and half-truths spread by the opponents of oil and gas development, transportation, and use. Secondly, we want to give regular Canadians who support oil workers and oil families a voice so they can join the national discussion and share their personal stories. And finally, we want to remind the public, media, and government that as Canadians, we have some of the highest living standards in the world because we can consume affordable energy through oil and gas, and we can develop them responsibly right here in Canada. The oil and gas industry is accustomed to the ups and downs of commodity prices. Ours is a cyclical industry, and we know that occasionally we will go through periods of low prices, job losses, and consolidation. But in this latest downturn, we have lost over 110,000 oil and gas jobs. It's the worst downturn since the 1980s. Oil workers aren't just losing their jobs, oil families are losing their homes, and businesses are going bankrupt. And soft oil prices aren't the only problem. Today, misinformed criticism from foreign celebrities, radical environmentalists, and grandstanding politicians continues to distort the record of Canada's oil and gas industry in order to prevent Canadians from building pipeline infrastructure and access to new markets. Take, for example, Leonardo DiCaprio, a brilliant actor, philanthropist, private yacht enthusiast, and apparently an expert in all forms of energy development. Now, we all know he lives off the land in the movies, and it takes full advantage of fossil fuels in real life. Gregor Robertson, the mayor of Vancouver and former director of Tides Canada, a radical environmental organization funded by U.S. special interests to shut down Canada's oil sands, was recently caught using taxpayer dollars to protest pipelines. Is it a coincidence that elites such as successful actors, musicians, well-to-do politicians, and socialites seem to be at the forefront of this movement? They lead lives that are difficult for the rest of us to imagine, yet they seem eager to tell us how we should live ours. Unfortunately, on this side of the velvet rope, people still have to work for a living. Life off the red carpet is not that easy to begin with, and it gets even harder when those on the red carpet insist on shutting down the industries thousands of Canadians depend on for their livelihoods. Many opponents of Canada's oil and gas industry would have you believe that if Canada quit producing oil, the world's greenhouse gas emissions would be significantly reduced. This, of course, is untrue. Other nations would immediately step in to make up the extra production. In fact, the current decline in oil prices has been caused by increased production from countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, Venezuela. And none of these countries meet the same strict carbon emission standards as Canada, not to mention Canada's higher labor, safety, and human rights standards. Despite this, imports of Saudi, Nigerian, and US oil have risen significantly in Canada over the years. The reality is the world needs more Canadian oil and gas, not less. And the planet, well, it would be better off in many ways if a bigger share of the world's oil production came from Canada. What many radical environmentalists and some politicians would argue is that fossil fuels are bad and renewable energy is the only way forward to protect our environment. But that is simply not true. All forms of energy development have an impact on the environment. The manufacturing of many wind turbines and solar panels require rare earth metals, the vast majority mined in China, with limited environmental oversight. Because of this, toxins and radioactive waste have created unheard of damage to the environment in China. Now, my objective here is not to be critical of one energy source over another, but to challenge us to have a balanced conversation about our energy future. The answer is not all renewables or all fossil fuels, but a mixture of all energy sources that provides us with affordable and reliable energy. According to the International Energy Agency, global demand for energy is expected to increase by 37% by 2040, and fossil fuels will make up 75% of the global energy mix. The facts are clear. The world does not need Canadian oil and gas. The world just needs oil and gas. So doesn't it make sense for it to come from a country like Canada? Over the last 30 years, Canada's oil and gas industry has provided hundreds of billions of dollars in tax revenues for governments across the country, which they have used to hire nurses and teachers and to build schools for our children and hospitals for the sick. Profits from oil and gas have helped ensure the sustainability of public and private pension plans and RRSPs. Hundreds of thousands of Canadians have enjoyed terrific careers in the oil and gas sector. But when critics distort the record and the facts, they attack the workers and the families of one of the most important drivers of the Canadian economy. They also attack an industry that is an environmental leader compared to every competitor we have anywhere in the world. The industry has always invested heavily to improve its environmental record. About $1.3 billion has been voluntarily committed from industry through the Canadian Oil Sands Innovation Alliance, which has developed some 800 technologies and innovations to reduce the impact on water, land, and air. The leaders in the production of wind and solar energy are also some of Canada's largest oil and gas companies, such as Enbridge, Suncor, Shell, and TransCanada. Profits from oil and gas development and transport make that possible. Now, these things aren't just my opinion. These are simply the facts. And we are calling on fair-minded Canadians and our elected representatives to acknowledge these facts and to recognize the contribution this industry makes to Canada. We're asking for respect for our industry. Let's briefly run through the facts. The oil and gas industry is Canada's largest private sector investor. An estimated $80 billion was invested in 2014, $48 billion in 2015, and $30 billion in 2016. Yet even after a 65% reduction in investment, the industry is still the largest private sector investor in Canada. It represents almost 8% of Canada's GDP and nearly 20% of the Toronto Stock Exchange. The oil and gas industry produces annual government revenues exceeding $17 billion. It provides annual employment, direct and indirect, for approximately 500,000 Canadians. Annual revenues in 2014 were $150 billion, but in 2015, revenues were reduced to $90 billion, which would be the same as losing the entire auto sector from the Canadian economy in just 1 year. So are Canadian governments going to advocate for Canadian oil and gas workers and companies already meeting much higher environmental standards than those imposed on its competitors? Or are they going to allow the critics to crush our industry so that the United States, Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia can supply the world's energy demands? In 2013, Canada as a whole imported 43% of its oil, or 700,000 barrels per day. The most recent dollar figures by the National Energy Board shows that since 2012, Canada spent over $100 billion importing oil, filling the pockets of countries with lower environmental standards, countries like Nigeria and Angola. This data is from the global corruption watchdog organization Transparency.org. It shows that 90% of Quebec's oil is imported, and 37% of that oil comes from some of the most corrupt regimes on the planet. For reasons that elude me, Quebec would rather take oil from Algeria than from Alberta. They would rather have their oil transported up the St. Lawrence than through Canadian-made pipelines, easily the safest way to deliver oil and gas. Building pipelines will ensure that we can move Canadian oil to both domestic and international markets, meaning better profits for companies, more revenues for governments, and more jobs for Canadians. The proposed Energy East pipeline would mean a $15 billion shot in the arm for the Canadian economy. Trans Mountain would inject $7 billion, and Northern Gateway, $8 billion. Pipeline construction creates tens of thousands of jobs and injects billions of private sector dollars into the Canadian economy at risk of entering a recession. This is a photo of the oil and gas pipeline network in North America. The current pipeline debate in Canada would make you think we're talking about building a pipeline for the first time in North America. The reality is Canada has over 830,000 kilometers of pipeline and has been transporting oil and gas for decades, with a 99.999% safety record. Controversy surrounding the oil and gas industry is being used by people in different ways. For example, the rejection of Keystone XL in the United States was presented as a hard stance on climate change and Alberta's dirty oil. In reality, it had nothing to do with environmental concerns. In fact, the U.S. State Department said in their final report to the President that the project would have no significant impact on the environment. In November 2015, the President stated, quote, "If we're going to prevent large parts of this earth from becoming not only inhospitable, but uninhabitable in our lifetimes, we're going to have to keep some fossil fuels in the ground," end quote. Now, I would argue that actions speak louder than words. In the 7 years it took the President to make a decision on Keystone, 16,000 kilometers of pipeline have been built in the United States, the equivalent of 8 Keystones. The U.S. approved the lifting of a 40-year ban on domestic oil exports, and the incremental increase in oil production from the state of Texas alone is the equivalent to all of Alberta's production. There are 13 oil fields in California and 6 other international countries that generate more emissions per barrel than the Alberta oil sands. In fact, the title of the world's dirtiest oil goes to the Brass crude blend from Nigeria, where the uncontrolled release of methane during the extraction process generates upstream GHG emissions that are 4 times higher than the Canadian oil sands. Yet oddly enough, you won't see any protesters against imported Nigerian oil. Now, one can only assume the President was referring to Canadian oil and gas when he said that some fossil fuels needed to be kept in the ground. This is a wake-up call for all Canadians. The U.S. is Canada's largest competitor and has increased production by about 4 million barrels per day in just 5 years. Some analysts have argued that in less than a decade, the U.S. will not require any Canadian imports at all. The U.S. is our largest export market, consuming 97% of our oil exports. Without pipelines to export our product to other markets, our stranded oil commands far less than world price. It results in Canada subsidizing U.S. refining companies and U.S. drivers so they can fill up more cheaply at the pumps. This is not an attractive position to be in for Canada. I can't fault the President for his decision because the President is acting in the best interests of Americans. When can we expect our political leaders to make decisions in the national interests of Canadians? The most responsibly developed oil and gas should have access to broad international markets, but we need leadership from the federal government in order to build this needed infrastructure. We need the Prime Minister to champion pipelines, by far the safest and most cost-effective method of transport. We need the Prime Minister to be a champion for oil workers and oil families. If the provinces of our Confederation care at all about the facts and jobs, we expect our premiers and other elected officials to fight for pipelines the way that Premier Wall has consistently fought for them, as has Premier Gallant in New Brunswick. Mayor Coderre of Montreal, however, uses the same environmental argument as President Obama to block pipeline access through Quebec. These arguments don't hold water because he currently transports foreign oil from countries with non-existent environmental standards and terrible human rights records, instead of taking Canadian oil through Canadian-made pipelines, all of which employ Canadian workers and generate profits for Canadian companies and revenues for Canadian governments, the very revenues that his city uses to keep the lights on. Now, some grandstanding politicians like Mayor Coderre argue that Canada needs to shut down its oil and gas industry, and the best way to do this is to limit its access to new markets. So let's review what effect that would have on Canada and the environment. Without pipelines, Canada's economic success and the environment are disadvantaged. If Canada decided to get out of the oil and gas business altogether, our competitors with lower environmental standards would gladly fill the void. It would mean higher GHG emissions and greater dependency on foreign oil. Less Canadians would be employed, and Canadian governments would not be able to afford to build new schools and hospitals because of a significantly lower tax base. Now, Canada does have a role to play in global environmental leadership, but that role should be to offset and displace environmental laggards in the oil and gas production, not to walk away from development altogether. Unlike some of our competitors, Canada protects freedom of speech and freedom of religion. It protects minority groups and human rights. We adhere to health and safety and labor regulations. In 2007, Alberta was the first major oil producer in the world to put a price on carbon. Canada's energy regulators are modeled around the world as the best practice to develop responsible oil and gas resources. The world needs more Canadian oil and gas because our products are produced using Canadian values. For too many years, we have been complacent in our belief that Canadian governments understand the importance of the oil and gas industry in the lives of so many hardworking families. We thought the benefits of consuming and developing affordable energy in Canada were self-evident. If the majority of Canadians support the oil and gas industry, why do our political leaders seem more interested in standing behind a few radical organizations instead of regular, hardworking Canadians? It's time to stand up, Canada. The reality is that we are a resource-based economy. Oil Respect is about being unapologetically proud of Canada's oil and gas industry and all of our resource industries. It's about standing up for facts. It's about standing up for oil families and businesses, the backbone of the Canadian economy. We are calling upon regular, hardworking Canadians to demand respect from their political leaders. We will no longer tolerate politicians who pocket the revenues while denying the industry that produces them. We say to our governments, show some respect for unemployed and employed oil and gas workers. Let's show respect for companies who produce billions in tax revenues for governments. Let's show respect for the facts. If you care about the future of Canada's oil and gas industry, get involved in the Oil Respect campaign and share your personal stories and share with your friends and family. Here's what I need you to do. Promote Oil Respect in your social networks and encourage your families and friends to get involved. Check out oilrespect.ca and read the personal stories of those being affected by the downturn. Write a letter to the Prime Minister and your Member of Parliament and demand respect for oil workers and oil families. Demand the government approve pipelines so we can get Canadians back to work. Sign our online petitions showing your support for the industry. Follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook. And finally, proudly display your Oil Respect bumper sticker and t-shirt. With your help, we can make a difference because too much is on the line. Workers, small businesses, families, and our future. Thanks for watching. Oil Respect.